Hello, I'm Phoebe Lewis, the supplemental instructor for Dr. Byron Quinn's Natural Science Biology 1 course at Langston University. I've compiled a series of review videos that will help you with your final, and this review video is focusing on Chapter 4, the cell. Now in Chapter 4 we discuss the size of the cell, prokaryotes versus eukaryotes, the cell itself, protein production, organelles, animal cell versus plant cell, and cellular communication. The first main thing that we want to discuss is the fact that the cells are actually very small. Your plant and your animal cells are about 100 micrometers, whereas your bacteria are around 10 micrometers, and even the largest virus is even smaller than that, which range at 100 nanometers. So this figure right here shows you a relative size of the cell compared to some other things. The next concept that we'll discuss is prokaryotes versus eukaryotes. Prokaryotes, you learned, were your bacteria and your archaea. These are your simple-celled organisms, whereas your eukaryotes are your plant cells and your animal cells. Now, there are several differences between the prokaryotes and eukaryotes. For example, prokaryotes do not have nuclei. They don't have a nucleus, whereas the eukaryotes, they have a membrane-bound nucleus that contain the DNA. Also, prokaryotes tend to be quite smaller than eukaryotes, and they're often single-celled, whereas eukaryotes are again a lot larger than the prokaryotes, and they're often multicellular. Another difference between prokaryotes and eukaryotes is that prokaryotes may not need oxygen. There are several bacteria that are anaerobic, which means that they can survive without the presence of oxygen. However, eukaryotes, your plant and animal cells, need oxygen to exist. Also, the last difference that we'll cover is that prokaryotes do not have membrane-bound organelles, where eukaryotes do have membrane-bound organelles. Mitochondria is a good example of this. The next thing that we'll be discussing is the components of the cell. The cell has a nucleus, they have organelles, they have a cytosol, which is that liquid that the organelles are suspended in, they have a cytoskeleton, which are their structural elements, and then they have a plasma membrane. So this figure right here shows the cell in more detail. As you can see, you have a nucleus right here in this region. The DNA is contained inside of that nucleus, and in the center here you have a nucleolus. You have rough endoplasmic reticulum right here. They are rough because they contain ribosomes, which are your organelle that are crucial in protein production. Over here we have mitochondria. We have a Golgi apparatus right here. We have lysosomes, the plasma membrane, of course, and the cytosol is what the fluid that the organelles are suspended in. Now, one thing that we need to cover is protein production. You guys have learned this in class, and we've gone over it several times. This is perhaps one of the most important concepts in biology. Now, protein production occurs when the DNA inside of the nucleus transcribes itself into mRNA. The mRNA then leaves the nucleus through one of these nuclear pores and attaches itself to the ribosome. The ribosome then reads the instructions on the mRNA and produces a protein that is pictured right here. So let's focus on some of these organelles. First, the nucleus. The nucleus is the control center of the cell. This is where, as I mentioned, the DNA is housed inside of this nucleus right here. And then this is actually also where the transcription part of protein production occurs. As we just mentioned, transcription or transcribing occurs inside of the nucleus, since when DNA makes a copy of itself into mRNA. The next organelle that we'll discuss is the rough endoplasmic reticulum. The rough endoplasmic reticulum is a series of basically tubes, and these house some of the ribosomes, which are integral in making the protein. So the rough endoplasmic reticulum's significance is that it's also involved in protein production. Now, the Golgi complex is another system of tubes or organelle in the cell, and it has several functions. One of the functions is further protein processing and production, and it also has a very important function in um, exocytosis, or getting things out of the cell. Lysosomes are yet another organelle within the cell, and the lysosomes are basically the cleanup crew of the cell. They contain a lot of enzymes that break down cellular waste or old dead organelles that the cell no longer needs. So can be considered the cleanup crew of the cell. Mitochondria are another very important organelle, and these mitochondria are the sites, are the powerhouse of the cell, and are the sites of two very important stages in cellular respiration, which is how the cell gets energy. Cytoskeleton has a function just as entailed in its name. It is a structural component of the cell. These consist of microfilaments, intermediate filaments, and microtubules that somewhat hold the cell together or provide structure for the cell. So, an overview of the organelle functions. The control center, of course, is the nucleus. The assembly line for protein production, of course, is the endoplasmic reticulum. The distribution center, or the packaging center, is the Golgi complex, where the workbenches for protein production are ribosomes. The ribosomes are also found on the rough endoplasmic reticulum. The lysosomes we mentioned are the cleaning crew of the cell, whereas the powerhouse, where the cell gets its energy from, is the mitochondria. The cytoskeleton provides structure for the cell, whereas the cell membrane provides something like a security gate for the cell. The next thing that we'll discuss are the differences between animal cells and plant cells. As you can see here, animal cells and plant cells both make up eukaryotic cells. They are both eukaryotic cells, and they contain several of the same organelles. However, the plant cell contains a couple specialized organelles that the animal cell does not. For instance, this central vacuole right here, this wide open space, looks like there's nothing there. Well, that central vacuole regulates the water intake or fluidity of the plant cell. The central vacuole also contains these green organelles that my cursor is pointing to, which are called the chloroplasts. Many of you know that the chloroplasts are the centers for photosynthesis. So plant cells, let's speak more in depth about the chloroplasts. The plant cells contain specialized organelles for photosynthesis, and these are called the chloroplasts. So these chloroplasts are the sites of photosynthesis. Cells also have specialized features so that they can communicate with each other. Plant tissues communicate via plasmodesmata, which are just channels in between plant cells which allow a steady stream up for communication. Animal cells use proteins in gap junction. So gap junction is basically the communication from one animal cell to another using a specialized protein, and we call this gap junctions. So this is an overview. This chart is an overview of different organelles and their functions. So you can take a minute just to observe this, and a lot of these we've already reviewed. That basically covers Chapter 4.